you doing all? This is Monica here, once again, your host. And today we are going to read an article, about Sir Winston Churchill. I hope you all have heard about the Churchill. So there was one single speech, and I would be going to read that out for you today. Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, KGOMCHTDDL, FRSRA, 30th November 1874 to 24th January 1965, was a British politician, army officer, and a writer. He was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, when he helped Britain to victory in the Second World War, and again from 1951 to 1955. Churchill represented 5 constituencies during his career as a Member of Parliament. Ideologically an economic liberal and imperialist for the most of his career, he was member of the Conservative Party, which he led from 1940 to 1955. But from 1904 to 1924 was instead a member of a Liberal Party. Of mixed English and American parentage, Churchill was born in the Oxford Shrine to a wealthy aristocratic family. Joining the British Army, he saw action in the British India, the Anglo-Sudan War, the Second Boer War, gaining fame as a war correspondent and writing books about his campaigns. Elected as MP in 1900s, initially as a Conservative, he defeated to the Liberals in 1904. In H.H. Asquith Liberal government, Churchill served as the President of the Board of Trade, Home Secretary, and the First Lord of Admiralty, championing prison reform and workers' social security. During the First World War, he oversaw the Gallipoli campaign after it proved a disaster. He resigned from the government and served in the Royal Scots Fusiliers on the Western Front. In 1917, he returned to the government under Dr. Lloyd George as a Minister of Munitions, and was subsequently Secretary of the State of War, Secretary of State of Air, and then Secretary of State of Colonies. After 2 years out of Parliament, he served as the Chancellor of the Stanley Baldwin Conservative government, returning the pound sterling in 1925 to gold standard at its pre-war parity, a move widely seen as creating deflation pressure on the UK economy. Out of the office during 1930s, Churchill took the lead in calling for British rearmaments to counter the growing threat from Nazi Germany. At the outbreak of the Second World War, he was reappointed First Lord of the Admiralty before replacing Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in 1940. Churchill oversaw British involvement in the Allied war efforts against Germany and Axis power, resulting in victory in 1945. His wartime leadership was widely praised, although acts like bombing of the Dresden and his wartime response to the Bengal famine generated controversy. After the Conservatives' defeat in 1945 general election, he became the leader of opposition. Amid the developing Cold War with the Soviet Union, he publicly warned of an Iron Curtain of Soviet influence in the Europe, promoted European unity. Re-elected Prime Minister in 1951, his second term was preoccupied with the foreign affairs, including the Malayalam emergency, Mau Mau uprising, Korean War, and the UK-backed Iranian coup. Domestically, his government emphasized house building, developed nuclear weapons. In declining health, Churchill resigned as a Prime Minister in 1955. Although he remained as a Prime Minister, Member of Parliament until 1964, upon his death in 1965, he was given a state funeral. Widely considered, One of the 20th century most significant figures, Churchill remains popular in UK and Western world, where he is seen as a victorious wartime leader who played an important role in defending liberal democracy from the spread of fascism. Also praised as a social reformer and a writer, among his many awards was the Nobel Prize in the Literature. Conversely, his imperialist views and the comments on the race, as well as his sanctioning of the human rights abuses in the suppression of the anti-imperialist movement seeking independence from the British Empire, have generated considerable controversies. So friends, this was about the Churchill. Okay, now we will talk about his early life, childhood and schooling. Childhood and schooling, 1874 to 1895. Churchill was born at the family ancestral home, Bellingham Palace, Oxford Shrine on 30th November 1874, at which time the United Kingdom was the dominant world power. A direct descendant of the dukes, his family were among the highest levels of the British aristocracy, and thus he was born into the country governing elite. His parental grandfather, John Spencer Churchill, 7th Duke of the Marlborough, had been member of the Parliament for 10 years, a member of the Conservative Party who served in the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. His own father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had been elected Conservative Member of Parliament for Woodstock in 1873. His mother, Jenny Churchill, was from an American family whose substantial wealth derived from the finances. The couple had met in August 1873 and were engaged 3 days later, marrying at the British Embassy in Paris in April 1874. The couple lived beyond their income and were frequently in debt. According to the biographer Sebastian, the family were rich by normal standards but poor by those of the rich. In 1876, John Spencer Churchill was appointed Viceroy of Ireland, with Randolph as his private secretary, resulting in Churchill's family relocation in Dublin. When the entirety of the Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom, it was here with Jenny's second son Jack was born in 1880. There has been a speculation that Randolph was not his biological father. Throughout much of the 1880s, Randolph and Jenny were effectively estranged, during which she had many suitors. Churchill had virtually no relationship with his father. Referring to his mother, Churchill later stated, "I loved her dearly, but as at a distance." His relationship with Jack would be warm, and they were close at the various points in their life. In Dublin, he was educated in reading and mathematics by a governess, while he and his brothers were cared for primarily by their nanny, Elizabeth Everest. Churchill was devoted to her and nicknamed her Woomanie. He later wrote that she had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived. Aged 7, he began boarding at the St. George School in Ascot, Berkshire. He hated it, did poorly academically, and regularly misbehaved. Visits home were to the palace in London, where his parents had settled, while they also took him on his first foreign holiday to Gastein in Austria-Hungary. As a result of the poor health, in September 1884, he moved to the school in Hove. There, his academic performance improved, but he continued to misbehave. In March 1886, he was treated at the School of Pneumonia of the right lung by Robson Roos, the family doctor. He narrowly passed the entrance exam, which allowed him to begin studies at the elite Harrow School in April 1888. There his academics remained high. He excelled particularly in history, but teachers complained that he was unpunctual and careless. He wrote poetry and letters which were published in the school magazine and won a fencing competition. His father insisted that he be prepared for a career in the military, and so the Churchill's last 3 years at the Harrow were spent in the army form. He performed poorly in most of his exams. On a holiday in January 1893, Churchill fell and was knocked unconscious for 3 days. In March, he took a job at a cram school in Garden, South Kingston, before the holidaying in the Switzerland and Italy that summer. After 2 successful attempts to gain the admittance to the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, he succeeded on his 3rd attempt. There he was accepted as a cadet in the cavalry, starting his education in September 1893. In August 1894, he and his brother holidayed in Belgium, and he spent free time in London, joining the protest at the closing of the Empire Theatre, which he had frequented. His Sandhurst education lasted for 15 months. He graduated in December 1894. Shortly after Churchill finished a Starthurst in January 1895, his father died. This led Churchill to adopt the belief that members of his family inevitably died young. Cuba, India, and Sudan, 1895 to 1899. In February 1895, Churchill was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 4th Queen Anne Hussars Regiment of British Army, based in the Aldershot. This position earned him a wage of around £150 a year, which was far outstripped by his expenditure. In July, he rushed to the Crouch Hill, North London, to sit with Everest as she lay dying, subsequently organizing her funeral. Churchill was eager to witness the military action and use his mother's influence to try to get himself posted to the war zone. In the autumn of 1895, he and Reginald Bernays traveled to Cuba to observe its war of independence. They joined Spanish troops in attempting to suppress the independence fighters and were caught up in the several skirmishes. In North America, he also spent time in New York City, staying with the wealthy politicians. At the latter's Fifth Avenue residence, Cochrane profoundly influenced the young Churchill. Churchill admired the United States, writing to his brother that it was a very great country and telling his mother what extraordinary people the Americans are. With the Hussars, Churchill arrived in Bombay, British India in October 1896. They were soon transferred to Bangalore, where he shared a bungalow with the Burns. Describing India as a godless land of the snobs and bores, Churchill remained posted there for 19 months, during the course of which he made 3 visits to Calcutta, expeditions to the Hyderabad and the northwest frontier, and 2 visits back to the Britain. Believing himself poorly educated, he began to project of self-education, reading the work of Plato, Adam Smith, Charles Darwin, and Henry Hume. Most influential for him were, however, Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall, The Roman Empire, Winwood Reade's, and The Martyrdom of a Man, and the writings of Thomas Babington. Keenly interested in the British parliamentary affairs, in the private letter he declared himself a liberal in all but name, but added that he could never endorse the Liberal Party support for Irish Home Rule. Instead, he allied himself to the Tory democracy wing of the Conservative Party, and on the visit home gave his first public speech for the Conservative Primrose League in Bath. Reflecting a mix of reformist and the conservative perspective, he supported the promotion of the secular non-denominational education while opposing the women's suffrage, referring to the suffragettes as a ridiculous movement. Churchill decided to join the Malacan Field Force led by the Bindon Blood in its campaign against the Mohammed rebels in the Swat Valley of the northwest India. Blood agreed on the conditions that Churchill be assigned as a journalist to ensure he ensures this that he gained the accreditation from the Pioneer and the Daily Telegraph, for whom he wrote regular updates. In the letters to the family, he described how both sides in the conflict slaughtered each other, wounded, although he omitted any references to such actions by the British troops in his published reports. He remained with the British troops for 6 weeks before returning to the Bangalore in October 1897. There he wrote his first book, The Story of the Malaccan Field Force, which was published by Longman to largely positive reviews. He also wrote his only work of the fiction, Savlora, a Romana clef set in an imagined Balkan kingdom. It was serialized in the Macmillan magazine between May and December 1899 before appearing in the book form. While staying in the Bangalore in the first half of 1898, Churchill explored the possibility of joining the Herbert Kitchener military campaign in the Sudan. Kitchener was initially reluctant, claiming that the Churchill was simply seeking publicity and medals. After spending time in Kolkata, Meerut and Peshawar, Churchill sailed back to England from Mumbai in June. There he used his contacts, including a visit to the Prime Minister Lord Salisbury at 10 Downing Street, to get himself assigned to the Kitchener's campaign. He agreed that he would write a column describing the events for the Morning Post. Arriving in Egypt, he joined the 21st Lancers at the Cairo before they headed south along the River Nile to take part in the Battle of Omendrome against the army of Sudanese leader Abdullah ibn Muhammad. Churchill was critical of the Kitchener's actions during the war, particularly the late unmerciful treatment of the enemy wounded and his desecrations of Muhammad Ahmad's storm in Omdurman. Following the battle, Churchill gave a skin from his chest for a graft for an injured officer. Back in England by October, Churchill wrote an account of a campaign published as the River War in November 1899. Attempts at a parliamentary career in the South Africa, 1899 to 1900. Deciding that he wanted a parliamentary career, Churchill pursued political contacts and gave addresses at 3 Conservative Party meetings. It was also at this point that he quoted Pamela Plowden. Although the relationship did not ensure they remained lifelong friends, in December he returned to India for 3 months, largely to indulge in his love of the game of polo. While in Calcutta, he stayed for a week in the home of Viceroy George Nathaniel Curzon. On the journey home, he spent 2 weeks at the Savoy Hotel in Cairo, where he was introduced to the Kafdais Abbas. Before arriving in England in April, he refocused his attention on the politics, addressing further conservative meetings and networking at events such as dinner parties. He was selected as one of the 2 Conservative parliamentary candidates at the June 1899 by-election in Oldham, Lancashire. Although the Oldham seats had previously been held by the Conservative, the election was a narrow Liberal victory. Anticipating the outbreak of the Second Boer War between Britain and the Boer Republic, Churchill sailed from the Southampton to South Africa as a journalist, writing for a Daily Mail and Morning Post. From Cape Town in October, he travelled to the conflict zone near the Ladysmith, then besieged by the Boer troops before spending a time at the Estrop before heading for the colony. After his train was delayed by the Boer artillery shelling, he was captured as a prisoner of the war and intended by a Boer pork camp in Pretoria. In December, Churchill and 2 other inmates escaped the prison over the latrine wall. Churchill stove aboard a freight train and later hid within a mine, shielded by the sympathetic English mine owner. Wanted by the Boer authorities, he again hid aboard a freight train and travelled to safety in Portuguese East Africa. Sailing to Durban, Churchill found that his escape had attracted much publicity in Britain. He did not return home, and in January 1900 he was appointed a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse regime, joining the Red Bullers fight to relieve the siege of Ladysmith and take the Petrota. In his writing during the campaign, he gestured British hatred for the Boer, calling for them to be treated with the generosity and tolerance, and urging a speedy peace. After the war was over, the world called for the British to be magnanimous in victory. He was among the first British troops into the Ladysmith and Pretoria. He and his cousins, the Duke of Marlborough, were able to get ahead of the rest of the troops in Pretoria, where they demanded and received the surrender of 52 Boer prison camp guards. After the victory in the Pretoria, he returned to the Cape Town and sailed for Britain in July. While he had still been in South Africa, his Morning Post dispatches had been published as London at Ladysmith via Pretoria, which sold well. Early political career of Winston Churchill. Early years in Parliament 1900 to 1905. Arriving in Southampton in July 1900, Churchill rented a flat in London, Mayfair, using it as his base for the next 6 years, and hired a personal secretary. He stood again as a Conservative candidate for the seat of Oldham at 1900 general election, securing a narrow victory. At the age of 25, he was now a Member of Parliament. MPs were not then paid as a wage, and to earn money, Churchill embarked on a speaking tour focusing on his South African experience. After touring Britain in the late October and November, he proceeded into the US, where his first lecture was introduced by the writer Mark Twain. In the US, he met President William McKinley and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. The latter invited Churchill to the dinner but took a dislike to him. Churchill then crossed to Canada to give more lectures, and in the spring 1901 gave talks in Paris, Madrid, and Gibraltar. In October 1900, he published *An Hamilton's March*, a book about his South African experience. In February 1901, Churchill took his seat in the House of Commons, where his maiden speech gained the widespread press coverage. He associated with a group of the Conservatives known as the Huglings. Although he was critical of the Conservative government on the various issues, he condemned the British executions of a Boer military commandment and voiced concerns about the levels of the public expenditure. In response, Prime Minister Arthur Balfour asked him to join the Parliamentary Select Committee on the topic. He opposed an increase in the army funding, suggesting that any addition in the military expenditure should go to the Navy. This upset the Conservative front bench but gained support from the Liberals. He increasingly socialized with the senior Liberals, and particularly the Liberal imperialists like H. Asquith. In this context, he later wrote, he drifted steadily to the left of the British parliamentary politics. He privately considered the gradual creation by an evolutionary process of a Democratic or the progressive wing to the Conservative Party, or alternatively a central party to unite the Conservative and Liberals. In the House of Commons, Churchill increasingly voted with the Liberal opposition against the government. In February 1903, he was among 1,800 Conservative MPs who voted against the government's increase in the military expenditure. He backed the Liberal vote of the censure against the use of the Chinese indentures laborers in the South Africa in the favor of the Liberal bill to restore the legal rights to the trade unions. His April 1904 parliamentary speech upholding the rights of the trade unions was described by the pro-conservative Daily Mail as the radicalism of the reddest type. In May 1903, the Liberal Union MP Joseph Chamberlain, then the Secretary of State for the Colonies in the Conservative government, called for the introduction of the tariffs on the goods imported into the British Empire from the outside. Churchill became a leading conservative voice against such economic protectionism. Describing himself as a sober admirer the principles of the free trade, in July he was founding member of the anti-protectionist Free Food League. In October, Balfour's government sided with the Chamberlain and announced protectionist legislations. Churchill's outspoken criticism of Balfour's government and imperial protectionism, coupled with the letter of the support he sent to the Liberal candidate in Ledlow, angered many conservatives. In December 1903, the Odlum Conservative Associations informed him that it would not support his candidature in the next general election. In March 1904, Balfour and the Conservative front bench walked out of the House of the Commons during one of his speeches. He described their responses as a very unpleasant and disconcerting demonstration. In May, he expressed opposition to the government's proposed Alien Bill, which was designed to curb Jewish migration into the Britain. He stated that the bill would appeal to the insular prejudice against the foreigners, to radical prejudice against Jews, and to labor prejudice against the competition, and expressed himself in the favor of the old, tolerant and generous practice of free entry and asylum to which this country has so long adhered and from which it has so greatly gained. On 31st May 1904, he crossed the floor, defecting from the Conservative to sit as a member of Liberal Party in House of Commons. Under the Secretary of State of the Colonies, 1905 to 1908. In December, Balfour resigned as a Prime Minister, and the King Edward V invited the Liberal leader Henry Campbell Bannerman to form a new government, hoping to secure a working majority in the House of Commons. Campbell Bannerman called a general election for the January 1906. The Liberals won with 377 seats to Conservatives 157. Having had a previous invitation from the Manchester Liberal to stand in their constituency, Churchill did so, winning the Manchester's northwest seat with majority of 1,241. January also saw the publication of Churchill's biography of his father, a work he has been working on for several years. He received an advance payment of £8,000 for the book, the highest ever paid for the political biography in Britain to that point. On the publication, it was generally well received. It was also at this time that the first biography, Churchill himself, written by the Liberal Alexander Macallum Scott, was published. In the government, Churchill became Under Secretary of the State for the Colonial Office, a position that he had requested. He worked beneath the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Victor Bruce, 9th Earl of Alain, and took Edward Marsh as his secretary. The latter remained Churchill's secretary for 25 years. In this junior ministerial position, Churchill was first tasked with helping to draft a constitution for the Transvaal. In 1906, he helped oversee the granting of the governments to the Orange Free State. In dealing with the Southern Africa, he sought to ensure equality between the British and Boer. He also announced a gradual phasing out of the use of Chinese indentured laborers in the South Africa. He and the government decided that a sudden ban would cause too much upset in the colony and might damage the economy. He expressed concerns about the relationship between the European settlers and the indigenous Southern African population. After Zulu launched the Bambatha rebellion in Natal, he complained of the Europeans' disgusting butchery of the natives. In August 1906, Churchill holidayed on a yacht in the France, spending much of his time playing polo or gambling. From there, he proceeded to Paris and then Switzerland, where he climbed the Äggischron, and then to Berlin to Silesia. where he was guest of Kaiser William II. He went then to the Venice and from there toured Italy by motor car with his friend Leon Rothschild. In May 1907, he holidayed at the home of another friend, Forrest, in the Baites. In the autumn, he embarked on a tour of Europe and Africa. Traveling through France and then Italy, he traveled to Malta and then Cyprus. Before moving through the Suez Canal to Aden and Berbera, sailing to the Mombasa, he traveled by rail through the Kenya colony, stopping for the big game hunting Simba before heading through the Uganda Protectorate and then sailing up the River Nile. He wrote about his experience for Strand magazine and later published them in the book as My African Journey. President of the Board of the Trade 1908 to 1910. When Esquire succeeded Campbell Bannerman in 1908, Churchill was promoted to the cabinet as a president of the Board of Trade. Aged 33, he was the youngest cabinet member since 1866. Newly appointed cabinet ministers were legally obliged to seek re-election at a by-election. In April, Churchill lost Manchester North to the Conservative candidate by 429 votes. The Liberals then stood him in a by-election in the Scottish safe seat of Dundee, where he won comfortably. In his cabinet role, Churchill worked with the Liberal politician David Lloyd George to campaign social reform. In one speech, Churchill stated that although the vanguard of the British people enjoys all the delights of all the ages, our rear guard struggles out into the conditions which are crueler and the barbarism. To deal with this, he promoted what he called network of the state intervention and regulation akin to that in the Germany. His speeches on these issues were published in the volumes in Liberalism and the Social Problem and the People's Right. One of the first tasks he faced was arbitrating the industrial dispute among the ship workers and their employers on the River Tyne. He then established a standing court for the arbitration to deal with the future industrial dispute, establishing a reputation as a conciliator. Arguing that workers should have their working hours reduced, Churchill promoted the Mines 8-hour Bill, which legally prohibited miners working more than 8 hours a day, introducing its second reading in the House of Commons. In 1908, he introduced the Trades Boards Bill to the Parliament, which would establish a boards trade which could prosecute exploitative employers, establish the principles of minimum wages and the right of the workers to have a meal breaks. The bill passed with a large majority. In May, he proposed the Labour Exchange Bill, which sought to establish over 200 labour exchanges through which the unemployed would be assisted in finding employment. He also promoted the idea of unemployment insurance scheme, which would be part funded by state. To ensure funding for these social reforms, he and Lloyd George denounced Regnant Maccannan's expansion of the warship production. Churchill openly ridiculed those who thought war with Germany was inevitable. According to the biographer Roy Jenkson, he was going through a pro-German phase, and in autumn 1909 he visited Germany, spending time with the Kaiser and observing German army maneuvers. In his personal life, Churchill proposed marriage to the Clementine Hosier. They were married in September at the St. Margaret's, Westminster. They honeymooned in Bavino, Venice and Morvillo before settling into London home at 33 Esclade Square. The following July, they had a daughter, Diana. To pass its social reform into the law, Esquer's Liberal government presented them in the form of a people's budget. Conservative opponents of the reform set a budget protest league, supporters of its established, and the Budget League, of which Churchill became president. The budget passed in the House of Commons but was rejected by the Conservative peers, who dominated the House of Lords. This threatened the Churchill social reforms. Churchill warned that such upper-class obstruction would anger the working-class Britons and could lead to the class war. To deal with the deadlock, the government called a January 1910 general election, which resulted in a narrow Liberal victory. Churchill retained his seat at Dundee. After the election, he proposed the abolition of the House of the Lords in the Cabinet Memorandum, suggesting that it be replaced either by a unicameral system or by a new, smaller second chamber that lacked an inbuilt advantage of the Conservatives. In April, the Lords relented and the budget was passed. Home Secretary, 1910 to 1911. I wanted to draw the attention of the country by means of cases perfectly legitimate in themselves to be evil, by which 7,000 lads of the poorer class are sent to the gaol every year for offences for which, if the noble lord had committed them at college, he would not have been subjected to slightest degree of inconvenience. Winston Churchill in the House of Commons. In February 1910, Churchill was promoted to the Home Secretary, giving him control over the police and the prison services, and he implemented a prison reform program. He introduced a distinction between the criminal and political prisoners, with prison rules for the latter being relaxed. He tried to establish libraries for the prisoners and introduced a measure ensuring that each prison must put on either a lecture or a concert for the entertainment of the prisoners 4 times a year. He reduced the length of the solitary confinement for the first offenders to the 1 month and for the recidivists to 3 months, and spoke out against what he regarded as the excessively lengthy sentence meted out of the perpetrators of the certain crimes. He proposed that abolition of the automatic imprisonment of those who failed to pay the fines and put a stop to the imprisonment of those aged between 16 and 21, except in cases where they had committed the most serious offences. Of the 43 capital sentences passed while he was Home Secretary, he commuted 21 of them. One of the major domestic issues Britain was that of the women's suffrage. By this point, Churchill supported giving women the vote, although would only back a bill to that effect if it had majority support from the male electorate. His proposed solution was referendum on the issue, but this found no favour, with the English and the women's suffrage remained unresolved until 1818. Many suffragettes took Churchill for a committed opponent of the women's suffrage and targeted his meetings for protest. In November 1910, the suffragette Hugh Franklin attacked Churchill with the whip. Franklin was arrested and imprisoned for 6 weeks. It was these militant suffragettes who were the primary beneficiaries of Churchill's relaxed rules for those categorized political prisoners. In summer of 1910, Churchill spent 2 months on a D-first yacht in the Mediterranean. Back in Britain, he tasked the chief constable of the Glamorgan requested the troops to help the police quell the rioting. Churchill, learning that the troops were already travelling, allowed them to go as far as Swindon and Cardiff, but blocked their deployment. He was concerned that the use of the troops could lead to the bloodshed. Instead, he sent to 70 London police, who were not equipped with the firearms, to assist with Welsh counterparts. As the riots continued, he offered the protesters an interview with the government chief industrial arbiter, which they accepted privately. Churchill regarded both of the mine owners and striking miners as being very unreasonable. The Time and the other media outlets accused him of being too soft on the writers. Conversely, many in the Labour Party, which was linked to the trade unions, regarded him as having been too heavy-handed. Asquith called a general election for December 1910, in which the Liberals were re-elected and the Churchill again secured his Dundee seat. In January 1911, Churchill became involved with the siege. Sydney Street. 3 Latvian burglars had killed the several police officers and hidden in a house in London East End, which was surrounded by police. Churchill joined the police, although did not direct the operation. After the house caught fire, he told the fire brigade not to proceed into the house because of the threat that the armed Latvians posed to them. After the event, 2 of the burglars were found dead. Although he faced criticism for his decision, he stated that he thought it better to let the house burn down rather than spend good British lives in rescuing those ferocious rascals. In March 1911, he introduced the second reading of the Coal Mines Bill to the Parliament, which, when implemented into the law, introduced stricter safety standards to the gold mines. He also formulated the Shops Bill to improve the working conditions of the shop workers. It faced opposition from the shop owners and only passed into the law in much later. To maintain the pressure on this issue, he became president of the Early Closing Association and remained in that position until the early 1940s. This is the end of the part 1. We will do the rest in the part 2. Please do subscribe and like my channel, Reflective Minds. Thank you for watching this. Thank you. Bye.